Good morning. My name is Bob Isler. I'm the director of the Langdale Center for Forest Business at the University of Georgia in the holy city of Athens. And it's a pleasure to have all of you here this morning. As was mentioned last night, we have a record crowd, and it's great to see that. It's great to see so many people in our community here for our program. We've got three speakers this morning, all of whom I knew as graduate students in the Langdale Center. I'll give you a little bit of information about each, and then let them go ahead and they'll kind of cycle through. They've got their own little routine laid out. You will like it. These are some really, really great minds, but what they also do is what most of us don't do is they know how to communicate what they know so the goats can get at it, and you'll love their presentation. Our first speaker is Dr. Brooks Mendell, who is the president of Forisk. And he'll touch on the macro drivers in the forest industry's capital investment in the South, because the South's the only place that counts. He'll highlight the link between housing and softwood grade lumber in the South, Pacific Northwest, and Canada. Amanda Lang is a senior consultant with Forisk. She will discuss emerging wood markets, forest industry capacity and timber supplies, capital investment trends in wood-using mills, and the capacity for traditional forest industries and emerging markets like bioenergy. Dr. Sean Baker will identify forest operational changes and how Georgia companies compare to other regions in the U.S. So, you know, the books on public speaking tell you that you're supposed to tell the audience something that's not in the bio. Well, since I knew all these folks so well for so long as graduate students, I'll tell you what you won't find out about all three of them. Brooks was an All-American baseball player. Amanda's nickname is Tinkerbell. And Sean likes to travel the world on foot by himself. Brooks, it's all yours.
Thank you, Bob. He's like my mom. He always makes me feel confident. Thank you. Years ago in the 90s when I started my career, I was out in the Pacific Northwest working at a logging camp, and I worked for a harvest manager named Kelly Stanley. And one thing he used to do is he used to like to quote country songs. And one of the guys he used to quote a lot was a guy named Joe South, who was actually born and raised in Georgia. And he used to use this line. He'd say, "Hey, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse, walk a mile in my shoes." Walk a mile in my shoes. It's such a simple idea, right? And yet it is so difficult to execute. I know what I think, but do I really want to know what that other person thinks? As soon as we buy a piece of land, hire a forester, and grow some trees, we just care about what we're going to get for those trees. And yet that's really just one half of the equation. There are two pieces to the pie in our sector. There's people who grow the trees, and there are people who buy the logs. So I'm going to address a few things. The first is take a minute to consider the other side of the story for the purpose of better understanding the current situation, to just talk about what's really knowable. Then I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the economy, which is the hardest thing to know. And then take a look at what we can know and what we can't know, and put them together to take a position on what we could know about how things are going to look in the future. In our work, we spend a lot of time with clients identifying places, to build, buy, or expand wood-using capacity. That's the other side of the story. That's where people are putting capital to build mills, and they really care about a very specific set of issues. Now, if you're an economist and you look at the world and you want to know what are countries doing here and what are industries doing there, we always sort of talk to the same things. You talk about labor, where is it plentiful and where is it cheap? You talk about capital, where can I get a hold of some money? Where can I make some loans or sell some stock? You talk about technology, where do we actually know how to do things? And the fourth thing we talk about is land. Without space to do something, you can't do anything, especially in manufacturing or land or ag or anything that relates to something where you need some space on the ground. And when it comes to wood-using facilities, there are very specific land-related things that we really care about. We care about where the wood comes from, so what stuff's going into the mill. That's the resource side. Is it available? That means, will people sell it to you? Is it accessible? That means, can you get a truck to it? Is it sustainable? That means, will it be there 10, 20, 30 years from now after you build your facility? But the other side of the story is, well, once you make something, you've got to sell it to somebody, and where are those people? Where are my customers? How do I get product to them? Where are the roads, rail, ports? And those issues are a little different by end market. And in our work, we're always looking at these individual different local markets and saying, here's the resource, here's the logistics, this one's good, this one's not good. But it's an incomplete story. Because at the end of the day, no matter what you think about a local market, it is subject to what you think is going to happen in the economy. And do we know what's going to happen in the economy? We have no idea. I mean, if there's anything we know, everybody in the sector and out of the sector and professional economists, and you talk to the Federal Reserve, and every time you see them do a press conference, they say, well, our models were wrong for the last 16 quarters, but we might get it right the next time. That's the world we live in. That's reality. That's just accepting the facts the way they are. We do the best we can with the information we have. That said, just saying that we can't predict the future is not an excuse to not do our best to understand the current situation. So let's talk about that. What is the current situation? So I'm going to share a few things that we track in the economy so that we try to stay on top of what's going on, so we actually have a starting place. What we found is people tend to be selective in their use of facts. I've got 2 daughters, and I'll have the conversation, did you take a cookie out of the cookie jar? And she'll say, my older one will say, oh, Daddy, you meant this cookie jar. I meant, yeah, that cookie jar. Not the other one, not the neighbor's house. How do we be complete about, let's just get super clear about what we're tracking. And so we hear the same thing. People will say, well, interest rates are doing that, and capital costs are doing this, and employment is doing the other. So to try to get away from that, about 3 or 4 years ago, what we started doing was we just started tracking a lot of the same variables that the Fed is tracking. And we tried to eliminate double counting just so we'd know, like, no matter what we read in the paper, because a lot of the monthly statistics are noise, how do we just stay on top of what's going on? So we have this simple score. We've been publishing it now for a couple years in our quarterly research, and it's just a way to stay on top. And here's what we look at. Basically, 3 sets of numbers. The first one just has to do with growth and production. Just want to know, is the economy growing? Are we producing products? Are we building houses? Positive. Are they doing better than they were in the past? What's the trend? If those 3 things look good, what it means is we're making stuff across multiple sectors. So things ought to be okay. We have growth. Then the next set of things we look at is investments. So when you look at investment performance, it should tie back to what guys are doing on the ground. If we're making a lot of product, then how are investments doing? Are corporations profitable? And that's totally measurable and reported every month. And is the market doing well? Because if we're building a lot of stuff and making a lot of stuff, but investments are doing poorly, and we have situations where that happens, something's wrong. But if we're producing stuff and making stuff, if investments are doing okay, the economy's growing. When we have growth, though, we have friction. That's the third bucket of stuff. There are ways to slow the economy down. What are the headwinds, and what are those main things? So we look at 3 things. We look at inflation, something people look at. If prices are going up, things get more expensive. We look at unemployment. And we look at the 10-year Treasury. Why do we look at that? Because that's an indicator of the cost of money. If Treasuries are going up, it means it's more expensive to borrow. And what we have found is just plotting these numbers over time, and when you net them out and we sort of weight them to current observations, is as long as that number is above 2, we have a sort of a scoring of 2. If we have this number of 2, what it means is that the economy is flat and it's just cooking along. And if our scoring's above 2, it means we have some growth. And if we're below 2, something's wrong. The other thing it does is when we have that number bouncing up and down, when we drop below 2, it says, hey guys, why don't you spend a little extra time this month or this quarter looking at what's going on in the economy? Because sometimes nothing is going on. Sometimes a housing forecast or an economic forecast doesn't mean anything because there's no real change. It is not equally important all the time. Sometimes it's more important than others. And so the reason we have a score is we just want a little engine light to go off and says, hey, now's the time to spend a little more time looking at what's going on in the economy, because when the economy has big changes, it adversely affects our sector. That said, when we're sort of cooking along and things are growing, and we've had growth now, 6 years of positive economic growth. As Paul mentioned earlier, it's slower than we wanted it, but it's been positive. Unemployment, 6 years of positive job creation. Maybe it's less than we wanted, but it's been positive. There's been a lot of positive aspects going on in the economy. But one of the most important ones for our sector is housing, and that is the one that we do spend extra time on every quarter. So what is the story with housing? Well, one thing about housing is we're building twice as many houses now than we were 6 years ago. Twice as many. So it's been not as big as everybody wanted, but it's been positive. 10% growth over last year. Last quarter was 15% over the same quarter a year ago. We are building more houses out of wood. And we track it every year, and we sort of project it forward, but we don't spend a lot of time on our forecast. One thing we found is one of the best ways to forecast a macroeconomic variable like growth or inflation or housing is take an average of everybody else's forecast. There's math behind this. There's like real people have graduated with PhDs that said, hey, if you want to build a forecast, just average everybody else's. And it works really well for housing. One reason it works well is that people have different approaches, and when you take an average of their approaches, you in effect wash out the weak parts of their models and you keep the strong parts of their models. And we've been using this approach for 5 or 6 years, and if you compare what we're putting out there, which is again nothing unique or special to other projections you read, you'll find it gets pretty close to where things end up. We're typically, like everybody else, 6 months too optimistic. Pretty much the same story. This year, the forecast right now, 1.21 million housing starts. That's the projection for 2016. Last year, we were 1.1 million, so about 8, 9, 10% more. Now, one thing we get about housing starts is we get the following question. We say, well, that's nice, but the houses we're building are changing. You know, they're getting smaller, and we're building all these multifamily units, and we're not going to be using as much wood. That's sort of when we go, is that true? We hear it, but is it true? And so that is where we spend our time. You want to confirm the facts on the ground. And the facts on the ground are kind of interesting. What do you find about houses in our country? They're getting bigger. And they've been getting bigger for a long time. They're not getting smaller. In fact, you're looking at a 40-year history of home building, those lines. And the picture on the top are homes from the 50s, and the picture at the bottom is a home being built about 8 years ago. The houses in our country, single-family homes, have consistently been getting bigger. And not just a little bit bigger. We're talking homes going on average single-family from 1,700 square feet to last year, the largest homes ever built in our country's history, averaging almost 2,300 square feet in size as a country. Tremendous growth in the size of our homes, which translates into more wood use. So that's the national story, but today we're really interested in what's going on in our region or even in our local market. And when you start to think about how do those homes translate into what's going on in the South, it tells us something about our local markets. And all this figure reminds us is that most of the homes being built in this country are in the South. Paul referenced this as well. 54% of the home starts in our country, U.S. South. Other parts of the country getting smaller. And in fact, when you do it state by state across the South, where are homes being built? Where there are people? Where are some of the best home markets in our country, and where have they been for the past 5 years? Places like Texas and Florida. And we've had a decent market in Georgia, and you've had a decent market in the Carolinas. And then if you plot stumpage prices along the map, what do you find? Where do you find the largest, highest stumpage prices across the South? When you compare them, you find them in those places, because that is where the mills are running at higher rates. It is where demand is stronger. it is where more wood is being consumed. That's why if you want to speak at one of these association meetings, we'd rather be at Georgia's meeting or Texas's meeting and not really at Mississippi's meeting, because nobody lives in Mississippi and they're having a pretty tough time right now. They're last in line, in effect. The other thing that it reminds us is, the mills and the demand, they go to where the resource is. Where are the trees in our country? They're in the south and the northwest, and some are in the northern reaches. But when you really look at demand and where value is created by trees, it's helpful to remind ourselves that more than 50% of the softwood lumber capacity in the country is in the south. More than 60% of the plywood capacity in this country is in the U.S. South. More than 70% of the OSB capacity in this country is in the U.S. South. It's where the capital has been flowing, and it's been flowing this way for decades. It's where the wood use is. But when you think about each of those end markets, some are more important than others. I tell this story because it's something my mom told me before I got married, which is, she said, son, until you get married, I'm the most important woman in your life, but when you get married, your wife becomes the most important woman in your life, and you should understand that, and I understand that, which makes for a great mother-in-law. I'll just say, my wife will tell you that. So this idea that some things are more important than others is super true in our sector. It's nice that we have all this OSB capacity. It's nice that we have all this plywood capacity. We have a lot of pulp and paper mills, super important. But our sector is driven off of lumber. When you look at how cash is generated and volume is generated from timberland investments, what the timber REITs are doing, what the TIMOs are doing, a lot of those models depend very strongly on demand for chip and saw and saw logs, and that demand for those logs ties directly to housing markets. And so it's super important, if you know nothing else with respect to demand and pricing moving forward, is to keep up with the demand for those solid logs that are producing lumber. Super, super important. In any given local market, other facilities, super important as well. But what drives timberland investment, what drives the incentives to put silviculture back in the ground, comes down to demand for grade logs. So this is a look at softwood lumber production by region in the U.S., in the United States. And so when you think about that lumber capacity, we talked about the country and all the homes being built. We talked about where the mills are, which is the biggest chunk is in the U.S. South. But then you have to take that and you have to start to look forward about what could be the story. And so when we project things forward, we start basically where the facts are on the ground, where the mills are, where the supplies are. And Amanda's going to be talking to this. And we project forward where it could be. Where are those 2x4s and 2x6s actually going to be produced? And you simply extend out the string and you see that we're in a situation where the story moving forward is a market where the U.S. South is by far the #1 producer of softwood lumber. And there's no reason for that to change. What's interesting about this story is the story has changed in the past. And what are the reasons for those change? And we want to know those so that we can sort of document the way it would look moving forward. If you go to the 1990s, it says the West. The U.S. West was the #1 source of softwood lumber. But it's not anymore. And it's impossible for it to be again. Why? Paul referenced this as well. We stopped harvesting as much off of public lands. So we cut off the supply. So even if housing goes to 5 million housing starts a year, the U.S. West just can't produce that much more lumber. Canada, #1 supplier 15 years ago. Mountain pine beetle. Even if they wanted to, Canada has a limit on how much lumber they could produce. And that leaves the U.S. South. And in the South, we've been growing a tremendous resource on the ground. The other thing is the capital has been following that resource. And the reason we know that is we track what all the companies are doing. And what this shows is how much capital investment has been taking place in our sector. 2013, 14, 15, and that 16 bar is really just for the first half of the year. And what you see is the forest industry sees exactly what you see and exactly what we track. The economy is getting better. The resource, strong and growing in the South. The markets are located close to the South. And so that's where we allocate our capital, is to the U.S. South. I'm going to hand it over to Amanda now to talk about the different end markets.